Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. I'm joined right now by Matt Makens with Makens Weather. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
Pretty good. Okay, the growing season is well underway. We got a varying amount of conditions kind of across pretty wide geography here of North America. Let's start in Western Canada. It's a real mixed bag. Alberta, relatively dry. Saskatchewan, much better than Alberta. And Manitoba, depending on which growers you talk to, there's a little bit of drought. So what can we expect here for the rest of the growing season when it comes to the weather pattern?
Well, we're going to actually hit a more favorable phase in July. And for some of us, that kind of kicked off in, mid-June. We started to get some wetter weather north of Calgary, kind of toward the Peace region. So we did start to see this pattern break down, the heat kind of break down a little bit, bringing in some more moisture. So as we go through July, and July for several months going back in previous forecasts has been kind of a favored period to get moisture. So our wet season would have been a little earlier, but we're just delaying it a bit. So as we go throughout very late June, which we're wrapping up into July, we're going to see a more favorable pattern. And that will mean kind of a storm track, if you will, storm flow from basically Edmonton, Calgary, and then stretch that out toward the Great Lakes in a broad swath. So it's still going to be hit and miss for parts of the prairies, but there will be some very favorable areas that come away with a surplus of water during the next month or so.
Yeah, and Alberta really hasn't had the heat yet. Like there's been periods where it has been warmer, but relatively speaking, it's been kind of cooler than some of the temperatures that they've seen in like Saskatoon or Winnipeg. Any particular reason for that, or is it just recency bias that I'm experiencing?
In the most basic of ways, let's look at the ocean temperatures. So the North Atlantic is really hot, and that created high pressure above it, a high pressure area. It links to hot ocean, and it itself is going to be hot in the summertime. And that's kept that dome of heat, the stagnant weather for such a big time over the east. Now, the opposite is happening out, say, toward Alaska and British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest of the States. That ocean's been a little bit colder. And we also have some colder ocean off of California. So you have hot influence on one side, the east side of the country, and then you have this cooler, unsettled influence on the other side. So we're still drawing in some of that cooler, relatively speaking, air for not necessarily British Columbia. They've had some hot temperatures, but you get into the mountains and then you get into Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan that have been cooler. There's another side of that too, and I think it's just tied into there's been a lot of moisture from Montana in the States down through Colorado, Texas. It's part of a feedback mechanism too, where Alberta may not have caught all that water, that rainfall, but it is catching some of the cooler temperatures as a result of what's happening just south. So basic level, oceans drive the big stuff. And then on a more local level, there's been wet weather nearby that's influenced the weather there.
Yeah, we've definitely seen where Montana in much better shape than say the past number of years. A lot of storms covering the state of Montana and working their way through Saskatchewan, Manitoba. I know on Monday night, drove through a crazy storm that I'm in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, on a road trip doing some filming, and I drove through a crazy storm where people are pulled over on the side of the road kind of stuff. Big dump. That's something that really has not been experienced, it seems,
right
in Alberta for sure.
So we're gonna if you could move that entire rainy air mass, if you will, we're going to gradually pull it into the prairies and then toward Manitoba, the Great Lakes region as we go through July. So it's kind of, in a way, the same rainy area, but we're just going to lift it out of the States a little bit, put it over Canada, mostly central and southern, and it will gradually work itself back toward the Great Lakes. So that's what you drove through is kind of a precursor of some of the storminess that will be trying to move back in.
Yeah. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I'm kind of hearing from you is that for the rest of the growing season here, we can expect, I guess, sort of adequate amount of moisture, normal sort of activity, or how would you describe it?
Best way to describe it is hit and miss.
Mm.
There's still going to be very dry areas that may not produce well at all. But there will be on the other side of that, flip that coin, you know, uh, over the next 30 days, parts of the there's going to be kind of a sliver, if you will. Imagine the Peace region, sliver it down toward uh, kind of the central and eastern prairies, and then go out toward Quebec with it. And that area will have a surplus of water. And if we're extending that through the reproductive part of, say, corn and things, it's going to be really good season. But still, there's going to be folks listening or watching this that are like, we've been bone dry, and some of those folks will stay bone dry. So it's not a blanket of water for everybody, but it's more like a scarf, if you will, that's going to cover a good portion of the region.
As we have this transition with La Nina and La Nino, one of the things that I heard from a farmer on the eastern side of the prairies was when historically, if he thinks back talking to his dad, that when this kind of weather pattern happens, the eastern prairies tend to get a lot wetter. Is that true?
There, it depends on the whole season. So we kind of go through these phases where there may be a 30-year phase where El Nino is favored. We're not in that right now. We're in about a 25-year period, almost 30-year period, where La Nina has been favored. And that's kind of driven by some other ocean things we don't need to get into, but mostly what's happening in the Atlantic. So what happens with the Atlantic can then be an influence on El Nino and La Nina. And to touch on what you just said, there's another thing that, La Nina used to be a great snow producer for Canada. The mountains did really well with La Nina patterns. That's changed with the Atlantic too. So yes, if you go way back throughout history, talk to a long-term producer, there are these phases where you transition out of La Nina into El Nino, and you'll get very wet phases. The problem is that the Atlantic, we're kind of in that one of those multi-decadal phases where it's not going to be that big of a boost. We're kind of more in a drought type frequency pattern, if you will, versus a surplus pattern. So yes, there is evidence to support that, but it depends on the time in history that you're talking about.
Yeah. So the real dry parts of Alberta, this locked in on the dry bias, although we have seen some storms roll through and some of them kind of devastating from a hail perspective. We have seen some very, very devastating hailstorms around Calgary. Locked in this dry bias for 23, or is this one of those years where it's dry it's dry through the growing season and then, oh hey, it's harvest, why don't we make it rain, and that's when the skies open up? Tell me that we're not going to go through that frustration.
The problem here is that drought feeds drought. So there's that feedback mechanism where you get late May into early June, mid-June. And mid-June should be when your soil is at its wettest point. For those parts of southern Alberta that are so dry now, there's going to be a bit of a feedback, and that feedback will take away moisture going forward. So I do think that driest area likely does stay dry and is one of those regions that really comes down to the timing of precip. Help any crop reproduction phases, and then going toward harvest. If you look historically, take historically similar patterns, and then set that on one computer monitor, if you will. And on this one, pull up all computer modeling. Just all it does is look forward.
Yeah.
If you compare them, both do show a tendency to get wetter toward harvest. And that makes sense to me because El Nino's it's not a huge impact on Canada. El Nino, La Nina, they have impacts, but it's not huge. But when you expect the biggest impact is going into winter through spring. So it makes sense that our weather pattern will gradually become more and more active going to this El Nino as we head harvest into next winter and next spring. So it does look like it may be a better tail end of the season for a lot of us.
Before we move on to central and eastern Canada, any early predictions on frost timing and that trends? We just had summer solstice. It feels crazy to start to talk about fall and winter, but from a fall perspective, is there any early predictions on what that kind of the temperature activity looks like come fall season?
From from just a broad perspective. So, in general averages, it's likely going to be a later frost because El Nino's, it has a warming impact. We're already super warm. Uh, that's not to say that we don't see a system develop over Alaska and it comes right over Alberta with cold air. I mean, we may see a storm that hits the freeze, but from a general, oh, we've frozen, we're staying that way, probably later in the season due to this impact of a warmer climate with El Nino. So I do expect a later frost, and certainly a kind of a later hard frost at the same time.
Yeah. Well, for growers with some decent crops, that's music to their ears. There's nothing worse than having a good crop and then having to go through that early frost. It can be
Yeah,
very
that
devastating.
getting rid of La Nina really helps that. La Nina is the cold one. So if you can get rid of her, your odds are much, much better.
Nice. Okay, let's move on to central and eastern Canada. A lot of growers, it seems like we're kind of living week to week. The rains have been coming on a timely basis, but we're really cutting it tight talking to a lot of growers where they're like, we could use some more now. We're a little
Right.
on the drier side. So what does this season look like from a precip standpoint for central and eastern Canada?
It's literally, as you and I are talking, it's favorable. I mean, there's a big old storm system sitting out over the east. It's hitting the States, it's hitting eastern Canada. A lot of water within that one. Now, there's a lot of damaging weather with it too. Severe weather's a problem. But so we're kind of going through literally as you and I are talking, and we'll go through the next several days into the weekend, early July, with a favorable pattern off to the east. So they are getting water. We still have, part of that may be too much for some.
Mm.
Last fall was kind of wet and those cereal grains emerged really, really well. The soil was soaked, had not a great winter, but, we had some late season kind of unusual snowpack that sat there late. So there are pockets where the soil is so moist, even after this weekend, early next week, we could have some flooding. But I don't want to take away from the need that we've got to get that water in. And that's happening right now. And as you go beyond this next week, let's go a 15 or 30 days. And the pattern, it's not going to be soaking wet this whole time, but we're in a better pattern by getting the water now, a few more systems on top of it. So there will be a surplus in a lot of Quebec going to the Maritimes over the next 30 days. And that's adding on to what we're getting right now.
Yeah. How about from a heat perspective? What does
It's
July and August? Are we going to get the real dog days of summer here for temperature wise?
it is going to be hot. Yeah. Going back to what we talked about previously about the northern Atlantic Ocean being so hot, that's going to keep an area, a hot dome, if you will, over the North Atlantic. And that hot dome's going to occasionally drift over eastern Canada, drift toward Europe, drift back. And every time it comes back, our temperatures are going to soar. And that's when we're still going to have fire issues. Temperatures will be well above normal. So, yeah, it's still going to be an issue. Eastern Canada, hot, hot, hot. Central and west, moderate to warm.
Okay. Okay. You said dome. So is that is that what we hear referenced a lot of times? Heat dome.
Yeah, you'll hear heat dome. That's
Yeah.
that's high pressure area. That's just kind of an area. Well, a high is dry, it clears the sky, is a saying.
Yeah.
In the summertime, if you hear the terms dome, ridge, high pressure, that's going to correlate to heat and drought.
Mm. We've been seeing a lot in the markets lately. A lot of people looking at this corn market as a bit of a weather market and some of the challenges through the U.S. Midwest from a rain perspective. Now, some storms have gone through. Some areas have received some rain in states like Iowa. What do you predict here for the Midwest for the rest of the growing season?
We have some challenges. Soybeans are a bit of a factor in that market for corn, but from just the corn crop itself, last year we favored from a little bit later reproductive phase. This year it may be slightly early. So we're talking over the next 2 to say 3 weeks is probably pushing it, but we've got to get water in the next 10 days. There are some storm systems that will favor, Minnesota. That's a big corn state. Iowa is going to be hit and miss. Illinois, northern Illinois is going to be hit and miss. Parts of Wisconsin probably do okay. So if you look at the US's entire corn belt, the central part of it, central and then lean east a little bit, that's the big stuff. That's where you got to get the water. That's where most of it comes from. And it's super hit and miss. The drought numbers have climbed there very quickly. So we have this building deficit, and we're probably just going to kind of break even into the next 10 days. And for a lot of growers, I think we're in for some yield reports after pollination, after silk and everything, that may not be as optimistic as how we started the season.
Yeah, that 183 USDA corn yields looking a little tight right now.
Yeah. But I mean, the next 10 days we do have systems to go through.
Yeah.
So at least we have that. At least we're not saying bone dry. But it's not the best outlook, I'm afraid.
So how come southwestern Ontario sounds a little bit more favorable? Do the Great Lakes factor into that than even say some of those northern states? It sounds like they're in a little bit better shape.
It's a part of just being into this late June and July pattern, where I kind of just talked about the dome or the ridge, the high pressure. It's going to kind of wobble between a couple of continents. It's in a wobbling phase away from us, so it's allowed storminess to be kind of east, central and east, but mostly east. And this high dome, it's going to kind of rule the roost. When it decides it's time to start drifting back, it's going to shut everything off. But these things like to oscillate. This year they're kind of doing it on a 20, 30-day cycle, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So we really have to take advantage of the next 20 days or so, since we've kind of been in it for 10 days, 20 days or so before we see this unsettled weather disappear. So for what you just said, it does seem to be in a favored area, but it's not a long-term favored area. It's just how things are reacting right now. And it's the same thing that's going to help that parts of the U.S. Corn Belt. Once that dome comes back, we lose our unsettled weather and we're back into a pretty dry phase.
Timing is everything in weather, isn't it? Like it's so you mentioned timing a couple times. When I do interviews, say on mainstream radio, they say, well, you look at the annual precip. It's like, well, don't be distracted by the annual precip, because it's when that moisture comes that is so critical. And you mentioned that U.S. corn crop, the next 10 days being critical, that rain comes in 30 days. That's much different than if it comes in the next 10, based on how much precip we've had previous to this moment.
Yeah, we've especially corn, and especially late June through mid-July, that plant needs water. And if it's not getting it, then your yields are not very good. So yeah, timing is critical there. The other part for the industry that was good was the timing of the rainfall for the hay production areas. Hay and alfalfa are so much better than they were last year. And that's all due to timing.
Yeah.
Hay's not going to do you any good if it's wet in August. I mean, you can get it cutting, but you really need that May and June. And the same goes with corn. We got to get that timing down just right. And there's going to be some other phases down the road. Well, we'll have to talk about soybean and all that, but kind of the mystery element to me in my brain, the last 2 years we've talked about timing for the corn is critical. There's some hybrid corn out there that doesn't seem to care. It's just like, oh, I'm good. These guys made me, and I'm going to produce no matter what happens. So I'm good. But knowing where that kind of corn has been planted and stuff, that still is a mystery to me, because it's like I look at the weather data and I see drought, and your corn looks awesome. So
yeah,
maybe
what's going on?
Yeah.
So I heard you speak at the NCBA Cattle Convention back in the first week of February. You gave a great presentation on the stage. It was very, very well done. You think back to your address there in early February and what we've seen so far. Has anything surprised you, or has it turned out exactly as you thought?
I think the At that, I kind of led that speech by saying La Nina is pretty much done, and there were some cheers. A lot of
Yeah, there
producers,
was.
yeah,
Yeah,
we want, yeah,
I was
we
there.
want the drought to
Yay.
go. uh, the biggest thing uh, from that was the speed of this transition. It's like you can go from La Nina to El Nino in a matter of months, or it may take a couple of years. 2013, 14, 15 into 16, that was a very long drawn out thing. So hopefully it was well communicated. We don't know how fast this transition is going. Now, fast forward to today, and there was a very quick transition. We had nearly record setting La Nina atmosphere in January and February. And then all of a sudden, May and June, El Nino is running the show. And it's not in as much control now as it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we're seeing this transition that to me came on super, super fast, but now it's like taking a breath for a moment. So what surprised me most was the speed of the transition, the speed of spreading that rainfall from Montana down to Texas. My plan was more gradual. And the bad side of that is the drought in the Corn Belt. By speeding up this transition, we took the water from where I thought it would have been over here for the corn and the grape crop, and we've sucked it to the west. So that's what surprised me. And going forward, still question mark. So if you and I chat again in say 3 months or whenever, and you can ask me what surprised you since our last conversation, it'll probably be something evolving with this El Nino progression. Are we in a full bore El Nino, or did it fade back and we're just kind of in that we don't know what we're in and it's just going to change month to month? So that'll be something that we can chat about next time.
Has Australia experienced the change that they would expect in this weather pattern transition?
Yeah, North America is very tricky because we a lot of land, a lot of mountains, ocean basins are all not necessarily uniform. But you go down toward Australia and it's a bit clearer picture. And we're seeing their atmosphere react as expected. And that's we're drying off the south, we're drying off the east, uh, planning on pretty hot temperatures, and they're following that transition. They're not necessarily they are tied to the atmosphere being really El Nino, but they've got so much more ocean surrounding them in a uniform way that it's a bit more predictable there, if you will, if that makes sense. But yeah, their transition is going, and they're going to gear up for a lot of heat and some drought issues, so long as the ocean there is hot.
Well, Matt, I appreciate you joining us. If you love Matt's content in regards to some of the weather patterns and weather forecasts, make sure you find him at you're on Cattle Facts, also working with the NCBA and also CanFax in Canada. So check out Matt Makens and some of his weather commentary. Matt, thanks so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Enjoy.